cause of China's downturn in the economy? Is it cyclical or is it fundamental? And will the recovery of Europe really mean the recovery of China? Well, obviously, a recovery in Europe, God bless us, would certainly help the Chinese, because we saw problems really manifest themselves last August and September in the export belt. And we saw factory owners flee because they couldn't pay their debts. Some of them committed suicide. We saw workers take to the streets. And the only thing that really had changed was because orders from European factories had precipitously declined. It was the one big factor. And also we've seen in foreign direct investment from Europe decline by 42% in Q4, which is an enormous number. FDI, foreign direct investment, declined overall, but it would have been much worse had not the United States been investing more in China at the time to make up some, but not all, of the downturn. But there's a real problem that China faces. Forget about Europe. Now, I don't think Europe can recover in the near term for a lot of reasons, but that's a different story. But even if I were wrong and Europe did recover, China has some real problems. You've got to remember, why does China have growth right now? Well, in 2009, it started one of the biggest stimulus programs in history, late 2008, to avoid the effects of the global downturn. And so in 2009, Premier Wen Jiabao, who is the chief economic officer of China, dumped, according to my back-of-the-envelope calculations, about $1.1 trillion of stimulus into a then $4.3, $4.4 trillion economy. So of course the guy created growth. You couldn't help but create growth if you put in 20% of your economy as stimulus in 1 year. But what he also did was, that was more money than the Chinese economy could handle. So we saw the effects of too much growth. We saw inflation, stock market bubble, which has since popped, and a massive property bubble that is now in the midst of deflating. China in February was in its 6th month of property decline. And that's according to official figures. If you look at real numbers, it's much worse. So China right now is dealing with the aftermath of trying to deal with the 2008 downturn. Europe and the United States, for the most part, decided to take their medicine. China decided to try to overpower trends, and now is dealing with problems which are actually more serious than the issues it was dealing with in 2008. You look at the property market, because it's the real estate conference, you just mentioned some of the things that have happened recently. You saw in October, developers in Shanghai, Beijing, and other cities start offering discounts of 30% and more. One developer even talked about selling apartment units at cost. And we have seen another big round of discounting at the beginning of this year. This is a situation which has got to change, because real estate prices are much too high. Premier Wen Jiabao could reverse the situation by dumping in more money into the Chinese economy, but for various reasons he's not going to do that. And one of the reasons he's not going to do it is because if you look at the prices in China relative to wages, average wages, they're out of whack. And as we know in our country, yeah, you can maintain a big disparity in values and in wage rates for a long time, but you can't do so forever. And Premier Wen Jiabao, to his credit, is sort of trying to take his medicine now. But I think what he is doing is he's misunderstanding some of the fundamental problems that China faces. Because, as I said, if you look at those 3 fundamental causes that powered growth in the 3 decades of the reform era, they just don't help China at this point. And so, as I mentioned, the premier is basically going to be having to deal with some adverse trends. And right now, he's much more concerned about warning the international community that China can fall into another cultural revolution, which is what he did at the beginning of this month. He's much more concerned about infighting. He's much more concerned about Oshilai. And so he's not paying attention to the fundamentals, which is the Chinese economy. And besides, he's close to the end of his term, and so he's just trying to, I think, get through the last few months and then hand over these growing problems to somebody else. You put that all together, and I don't know whether you call it cyclical or not. I say it's more fundamental than most people think. But nonetheless, we have seen the global conversation about China's economy change. You know, in September, no one was talking about a landing. Now we're talking about hard landing versus soft landing. soft landing is supposed to be 8%. But when you have an economy which is growing at 3, 4, or 5, in reality, that's a problem. Because not only is it at 3, 4, or 5 right now, but it's going towards zero growth, and perhaps worse.